Good morning, everyone. I am Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. Secretary Ramírez, as this is your first trip to Washington since assuming the position of Secretary of Finance and Public Credit, it's my pleasure to welcome you to DC in that capacity and to this virtual Atlantic Council meeting. The Secretary, an economist by training, helped to formulate the economic policy agenda of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. The Secretary has focused on advancing inclusive economic growth at this important moment by bringing his insights from his experience in the private sector to the Finance Secretariat. Mr. Secretary, we look forward to hearing your thoughts on Mexico's economic outlook and on opportunities to further advance U.S.-Mexico economic ties and thus to build a more prosperous North America. And now I will turn it over to Jason Marzak, Director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, who will moderate the conversation.
Thank you, Adrienne, and good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. Secretary Ramírez, it's a real honor to have you with us today for this conversation being jointly held by our Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center and our Geoeconomic Center. I look forward to this conversation today discussing your priorities for 2022, opportunities that may lie ahead for the U.S.-Mexico economic relationship, and of course, with this week's World Bank IMF annual meetings, your ideas on how international financial institutions can support Mexico and also other countries in the region in the economic recovery from COVID-19. With that said, Secretary Ramírez, you were confirmed in early August by the Mexican Senate and last month presented the 2022 economic package to Congress. It'd be wonderful if you could start off by please outlining your priorities for the year or years ahead, and more specifically, what opportunities and steps are you putting in place for an even better execution of public finances and social programs in the second half of the sexennial?
Thank you. Good morning, Jason. Thank you for your question. Thanks to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to this meeting. Our commitment in the 2022 budget can be summarized along three pillars. First, continue our support to the social safety network. Second, maintain healthy public finance, sustainable debt levels. Third, continue to support infrastructure, especially in the southern Mexico government priority projects. Additionally, in the second half of this term, the budget will be oriented to bolster the dynamics of the economic recovery. Let me give you three examples. First, we will strengthen health expenditure for pandemic response. For 2022, we're increasing health expenditure 15.2% in real terms. Secondly, spending in social protection will increase 13%. Third, we're investing more in regional projects to trigger development in the regions. So we are talking about a fiscal and total investment increase of 17.7% in real terms and 14.3% over last year's figure. Regarding public finance, this administration is focusing on optimizing and creating a more efficient execution of the public federal budget. Let me give you a few examples. From 2018 to 2021, we have observed a decrease of 5.7% in real terms in operational expenditure and a decrease of 1.5% in financial cost. Regarding our third pillar, infrastructure, the budget for fiscal year 2022 contains investment for programs and projects, including PPI, for 640 billion pesos, especially in railways, airports, highways, and harbors.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Three important pillars, especially now and especially looking forward. I'd like to ask about foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is, of course, critical to Mexico and critical to have for the resources to be able to move forward these different programs. What is your perspective on how Mexico can attract even greater FDI moving forward? And specifically, Mr. Secretary, what are some steps that Hacienda can take to incentivize more investment in Mexico overall? Of course, investment in southern Mexico is a priority for President Lopez Obrador. So perhaps with a focus on southern Mexico as well, the steps being taken to attract greater FDI moving forward.
Thank you. Let me start by giving you a few figures that would put things in context. We have $12.5 billion foreign direct investment inflows during the first quarter of 2021 and $18.4 billion during the first half of 2021. Apart from public investment in infrastructure, as a driver for private investment, we're aiming at higher integration to the North American value chain. Despite some setbacks coming from supply shortages and trade disruptions due to COVID-19 pandemic, Mexico will benefit from greater integration to the North American value chain that will increase the local and foreign investment in key sectors, as well as employment in human capital. With the entry of the USMCA agreement and the accelerated economic recovery, the investment climate in Mexico has improved, providing unprecedented outlook to take advantage of and increase trade integration. In fact, we have seen 123 potential FDI announcements for an estimated amount of $27 billion. In September, the US and Mexico agreed to relaunch the US-Mexico high-level economic dialogue to boost the economic relationship for both countries, centered on bringing value to the region throughout the relocation of value chains. We have identified 4 pillars. First, building back together to improve the regional business environment and strengthening the resilience of the supply from Mexico to the US. Its goals is to strengthen existing and new supply chain and promote US-Mexico economic competitiveness through innovation and improving land border crossing and marine port infrastructure. Second, promote sustainable economic and social development in southern Mexico and Central America, improving revenue sources by creating jobs and opportunities in the short, medium, and long term in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and southern Mexico as well, increases trade potential and spur investment. Third, securing the tools for future prosperity to bring resilience of value chains. This implies improving regulation and working in risk mitigation on issues related to information and communication technologies, networks, cybersecurity, telecoms, and infrastructure. And the 4th pillar is investing in our people to foster cooperation towards a more inclusive workforce that is better educated, more competitive, and better trained with the necessary skills to meet the needs of the 21st century economy. That's it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. If we have time, I'll want to go back and focus a little bit more on Southern Mexico opportunities there. But let me first move over to the IMF World Bank meetings. This week, you're participating in your first World Bank IMF meetings as Secretary of Finance and Credit. You met yesterday with World Bank President David Malpass yesterday afternoon. Given the state of the world, what do you think should be the main accomplishments of the World Bank IMF meetings this year? And how can international financial institutions further support Mexico, but also other countries in the region in the economic recovery from COVID?
Well, clearly, over the following days and since yesterday, I have been discussing how to achieve an inclusive and sustainable recovery. To begin with fellow colleagues from central banks, ministries of finance, and senior officers from the World Bank and the IMF, including yesterday with President of the World Bank, Mr. David Malpass. In particular, the equitable access and distribution of vaccines is essential to end the pandemic and for economic recovery. We cannot start thinking about an inclusive recovery if we don't achieve a full vaccinated population, especially in the most vulnerable countries and sectors. It is well known that high income and some middle income countries have the advantage to access vaccines by individual contracts, but others less fortunate do not have this opportunity. This is halting us from achieving a faster and inclusive economic recovery worldwide. Therefore, during these meetings, we will continue to explore how the World Bank and the multilateral development banks can contribute to guarantee access and distribution of vaccines everywhere. Other topics that have been discussed are the use of the SDRs, climate change, digitalization, and debt-related issues. On the latter, I would like to recognize the efforts done by the IMF and the G20 in improving the international debt architecture for debt relief to their poorest members. Nevertheless, we have been advocating to also analyze alternatives for debt refinancing for middle-income countries that are suffering the consequences of high levels of debt maturing over the short term. The COVID-19 pandemic accentuated many structural problems, for example, in climate change. In this regard, countries should maintain our commitments to fight the effects of climate change and to mobilize resources, public and private, using these criteria. We are using sustainable finance approach to promote market instruments for incentive aligning. Regarding how international financial institutions, we are in recovery path, and the international financial institutions have been working on tailoring financial mechanisms, especially for low and middle income countries, which have been the most affected. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. The first point you mentioned, equitable access of vaccines being key for recovery, is one of the many issues that we've focused on at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center for the region writ large. I want to go back. You were mentioning earlier the importance of sustainable social and economic investment in southern Mexico and Central America. And of course, President López Obrador has focused extensively on inclusive economic development in southern Mexico. How would an updated infrastructure package help to accomplish this goal? And also, what could be the benefits for Central America as well?
Central American countries have been put into focus by Mexican President López Obrador, and it has been, he has seen it as his role to bring that up to the attention of the US and also the Canadian governments as parties that could very much contribute together with Mexico to improve the living conditions and working opportunities for the people in Central America, and indirectly by that means to halt the pressure for immigration, which is provoked essentially by lack of opportunities for the people in these countries. We have been very encouraged by the response that so far has been indicated by the US administration regarding the potential for investment by the US in southern Mexico, Central America, but also by some early indications by the World Bank to be interested in financing development projects in the southern Mexico and also Central America with a view of long-term development. So far, we see this as a main contributor to improving the social climate across the North American region.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. One last question for you before we turn it over to a couple of fellows of the Atlantic Council who also have some questions for you. But you were mentioning as well, insofar as priorities for the World Bank, you mentioned digitalization. And the pandemic has, of course, forced many companies and services to go digital. So it's something that the USMCA was already contemplating. What do you see as some of the longstanding barriers in Mexico that have prevented more companies, services to go digital? And how is the administration, how are you contemplating working to address some of those barriers?
Our main challenge for expanding digitalization of the economy is centered at micro businesses. According to the economic census of 2019, 24% of big firms use digital technologies to sell their goods and services. However, this share is lower for small and medium enterprises, only 18.7%, and only 17.4% for micro businesses. During the pandemic, some of these percentages might have increased in a large measure. E-commerce has increased 54% during 2020. There is, however, a financial inclusion challenge. While many businesses managed to expand their online platforms, others are facing important barriers to participate in digital expansion. In Mexico, we're tackling this issue, promoting a new model of shared network, which has been named the Red Compartida, which aims to cover 92% of the population by the year 2024. We're focusing our efforts to cover around 8 million people that live in small villages and localities by 2022. We're also working on digital literacy. We want to increase the capacities for business to use digital tools and platforms into their daily tasks. The Mexican government conducted a pilot program to enhance financial and digital literacy among 1,400 women entrepreneurs. Some of the results from our last intervention during this period was an increase of 38% in the number of small and medium enterprises which start selling through the internet network.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. You've queued up a number of very important issues. We're now going to move to a couple questions from fellows of the Atlantic Council. We'll take all these questions in order and then turn it back over to you to respond to those. First, I'll turn it over to Ambassador Tony Wayne, who's a non-resident senior fellow at our Geoeconomic Center. Afterwards, Nicole Golden, who's a managing principal at NRG Advisory and also a non-resident senior fellow in our Geoeconomic Center. And then we'll turn it over to Bosco Marti, who's Global Director of Institutional Affairs and Communications at Aliatica and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center. Ambassador Wayne, let me turn it to you first.
Thanks very much, Jason. Mr. Secretary, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to ask about the broader effects of one particular sector. Moody's Investor Service last week issued a report saying the government's proposed electricity reform, and now I quote, is credit negative for the Mexican electricity sector because it would lessen its operating transparency, deter private investment in generation, disincentive renewable generation, and likely increase the overall cost of electricity. Also, Mexico's largest private sector association, the CCC, sent an open letter expressing deep concern over the recent closure of private energy storage and transfer terminals in different states of the Republic. How will you manage the potential for negative effects for Mexico's ratings and investment environment from developments in the energy sector?
I think we can manage by starting by explaining what's the framework to see that we connect and that we transmit our ideas. If you allow me, let me make a brief parenthesis to explain something that I think could clarify the president's and the government's view. The president is connected with its people at the ground level, that is the layman, daily on a personal press conference and physically every weekend in which he takes advantage to visit 3 to 5 cities and villages, changing the practice of the wall between the elected leader and its people. He has erected a wall instead between the business of government officials and the business of economic consortia. This wall has put an end to a long-standing practice of public concessions and policy design often in favor of selected business groups. Needless to say, this form of concessionary capitalism has also occurred in the energy sector and has hurt Mexico as it has worked to the detriment of state finances in the long run. Regarding your question more specifically, let me point out that this is currently a legislative initiative to amend the Constitution, which means it still needs to be discussed in both the House of Deputies and the Senate before it is approved. This initiative proposes a new Mexican electricity power system to promote an orderly development that favors security, reliable service, continuity, and stability of the system in the provision of the service. Mexico promotes the participation of the private investment community in the energy sector since the Federal Electricity Board, CFE, will purchase electricity and capacity from private generators without using the CFE as a financial backstop, which should incentivize cost efficiency. There was an abuse of energy self-supply schemes, autoabasto, in which private firms promoted a simulation of self-supply models that look more alike financial businesses. We have some examples of that. I will not spend time describing that because we're still under a period of discussion. But let me just stress that we are quite attentive both to market rating agency reactions and making double sure that we have a consistent model that is also consistent with market rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to be with you. Picking up on something you already introduced in terms of small, medium-sized enterprises, there are some 4 million SMEs that generate more than half of Mexico's GDP and employ nearly 80% of workers. So as you already mentioned, a vibrant and resilient small business sector and stable SME supply chains really are critical to inclusive economic growth and recovery in Mexico. And at the same time, as has been brought up, spatial inequality between regions or within cities was already a challenge and likely worsened by the pandemic economic crisis. So special loans to SMEs and family businesses to keep the doors open and employees on the payroll were a significant part of Mexico's stimulus and emergency response. So as you look forward to longer term growth and recovery beyond the digital programs you spoke about earlier, what kinds of initiatives and policies for SMEs are you carrying forward? And how do SME efforts fit into the plans and efforts to reduce territorial inequality and mitigate regional or rural-urban divides? Thank you.
Thank you. The SME universe in Mexico has the majority of economic activities centered around. And let me just stress that the size of these companies on average is quite small. So that would put in perspective the dimension of our support to this sector. Micro businesses incorporate and SMEs incorporate an important proportion of employment and have significant contribution to economic activity. Currently, around 68% of the employed population work on SMEs. For this, we provide financial support through the pandemic, mainly through two channels. First, in 2020, the government provided 1.4 million credits to micro businesses corresponding to $1.7 billion. And during 2021, we continue to provide 56,000 additional credits. Second, we provided credit to SMEs. Last year, more than 3 million SMEs were supported through credits, which represented a total value of $23 billion. In 2021, more than 5 million SMEs have received financial aid with a total value of $15 billion. We're also implementing social programs aiming to increase the productivity of farmers in rural areas through financial in-kind and technical support to enhance agroforestry systems. We call it Sembrando Vida. For us, providing aid to these types of micro businesses focus on the most marginalized municipalities in Mexico and will help the rural population to move out of poverty and increase productivity. Additionally, the government of Mexico decided not to increase taxes, so all firms do not face additional barriers on the economic recovery process, which is so important to consolidate. Thank you.
Thank you, Bosco.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for. Thank you very much, Jason. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for the opportunity of being here today with us. As he was mentioned earlier, there's a great coincidence by relevant actors, including Presidents Biden and López Obrador, on the need to address the root causes of migration and create inclusive economic growth and wealth redistribution. Could you share a little bit more with us how this updated infrastructure package would help accomplish this goal and what specific projects you foresee and areas of opportunity with Central America? Thank you very much, Secretary.
Thank you. This is a good chance also to air some of our concerns on regional development. President López Obrador is aware that the regional economic growth in Mexico has been quite uneven so far. From the regional perspective, we have two Mexicos. New development projects, which have been left aside as a tool of policy over the past 30 years, have started with special emphasis in the southeast of Mexico, a neglected region which hardly saw any positive impact from NAFTA, as well as in the northern border. To offset the regional inequality, we're investing in several projects to increase physical connectivity, as well as promote development in the region. Let me give you a few examples. One, we're investing on the expansion of roadways and highways in the region to increase connectivity. In Chiapas, we're expanding the highway from Palenque to San Cristobal. In Oaxaca, from Puerto Escondido to Huatulco. In Guerrero, we're working on the roadway corridor from Acapulco to Zihuatanejo. Second, we have also a project that aims at increasing refinery capacity and an infrastructure project to connect the Pacific with the Atlantic Ocean to facilitate trade between the East and West. In addition, we're investing on increasing electricity supply and capacity and gas pipelines connectivity to ensure the supply of energy. As I mentioned before, another key project is the railroad in the Yucatan Peninsula. According with the UN Habitat, the Maya train could bring 1.1 million people out of poverty in the surrounding territory. All these investments will contribute to trade facilitation and foster social and economic development in the region, otherwise neglected. We're already accomplishing results. Some states in the southeast of Mexico are starting to observe higher levels of employment. For instance, Tabasco is the first state not linked to US, exports to the US, which achieved a full employment recovery as of October 2020.
Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you very much for joining us and for your comprehensive review and outlook on the Mexican economy. And I want to also, on behalf of everybody here, wish you much success this week as part of the annual meetings here in Washington, and also, of course, the months and years ahead. We look forward to hopefully hosting you in person in the near future at the Atlantic Council headquarters. Again, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, and good day to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. Good day.
Bye.